The elections in Pakistan, held on February 8th, witnessed violence, allegations of vote rigging and fraud, and delayed results which have been unpredictable for most people who have watched these elections. The Imran Khan led Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, the PTI, have won the most number of seats in the National Assembly that went to polls, roughly 102 or 103 out of the 264 seats that the Election Commission of Pakistan would be announcing the results for. The results themselves trickled in and took almost 48 hours after the polls closed for the majority of the results to come out, which the PTI claims is proof enough of rigging by the Election Commission of Pakistan to ensure that the PTI backed candidates would not get the seats that they think they would have won. The reason for this is very simple. The elections themselves were held with the largest opponent party, Imran Khan's PTI, facing a state sanctioned crackdown, losing their electoral symbol, and having to register their candidates as independents and using social media to canvass for votes. The Nawaz Sharif led Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, considered to be a frontrunner and supported by the powerful Pakistani military, instead had a clear field and was considered by many to be the frontrunner till the results themselves have come out. The PMLN have won 73 seats, and Bilawal Bhutto Zardari's Pakistan People's Party parliamentarians has won roughly 54 seats, throwing up a hung parliament. But with questions of rigging, interference, fraud, mobile suspensions, and now police actions against independent candidates, the situation is fast moving. To sort of break that down, we have with us today Michael Kugelman, the director at the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center, who has written a lot on Pakistan through the years, to converse with us here at the Print. Thank you and welcome to the Print, Michael.
Thank you. Great to be here with you.
Like I said in the introduction, it's been a fast-moving few days, lots of unpredictable answers. Simple question going front. The elections were violence-marred. In fact, one seat had a candidate that was assassinated on the 31st of January. That was Bajor. Polls were not held there. In this violence, the day before, there were twin bomb blasts in Balochistan that killed 26 people. On the day of the vote, you had a lot of violence, right? But saying all of that, the elections were conducted. It has thrown up impressive results for people watching it. So what really happened in the build-up to these elections that we've seen this sort of result?
Right. So again, thanks for having me. I would argue that you have to go back to nearly the last 2 years. Ever since Khan was ousted in a parliamentary no confidence vote, Pakistan has been in an extended period of turmoil. And of course, after Khan was ousted, he blamed the army for being behind it. He refused to step back and simply prepare for elections. That would not be in his nature, of course, but he took on a very confrontational position against the military. And the military, not used to that type of challenge from a political figure, responded with a sponsored crackdown on Khan and his party, which intensified, of course, on May 9th, 2023, which is a pivotal moment in Pakistan's recent political history because Khan was arrested and protesters attacked several different Pakistani military facilities, which is, I would argue, unprecedented. I mean, you've had terrorists attack Pakistani military facilities, but not political protesters. And so that then led to the military really intensifying its crackdown, ratcheting it up to levels that I don't think we've seen in quite some time in terms of levels of intensity of repression. And that's when you started having, of course, Khan was arrested again in August. He's been jailed since then. Other leaders were arrested. Pressure to leave politics or pressure to shift to other parties. Hundreds, maybe thousands of PTI supporters were arrested. The media was pressured not to cover PTI. And then, of course, all the legal rulings, the court decisions, which, as you noted in your introduction, included one that deprived the PTI of its electoral symbol, which was hugely significant and impacted PTI's electoral prospects in a big way. So, there's been a lot of discussion about, well, we've never seen anything this bad. It's never been like this. I wouldn't say that. I mean, there's been some pretty difficult moments for Pakistan if you go into the 70s and the 80s, but I would argue that the tactics that were used by the army were not new in this case, but they occurred on a level of intensity that we hadn't seen for quite some time. That then brought us to the elections, and indeed, in the days leading up to the elections, you had Pakistani officials who were really bending over backwards to emphasize that this is going to be a perfect election. Those weren't their exact terms, but they said that we assure there's going to be free and fair elections. You had these very detailed reports coming out from the election commission specifying exactly how many pieces of paper had been printed out for ballots. So it was really this effort to legitimize the election as much as possible. And yet the irony here is that for the reasons I've just mentioned, the playing field was not level at all. The electoral playing field was not level because PTI had been disadvantaged in a very big way. So that's essentially the backdrop for the election. Of course, we could talk about what actually happened, but it was the type of election where this is again not unprecedented. There was one party that the military did not want to see come to power, and so it essentially shaped the electoral environment in ways that were meant to disadvantage that party's electoral prospects. As we know, that didn't work.
Right. I mean, just there were reports of PTI candidates having to go and hiding in safe homes to canvass and stand. So, in that sense, the kind of crackdown on the PTI was quite extensive, and I think and Khan himself just a week before got multiple convictions in the Cypher case, the Tosha Khana case. Then his marriage was ruled illegal, which sort of highlights the kind of crackdown. But then that didn't seem to deter close to 60 million people who turned up and voted. With despite all of these allegations, you see the PTI, or at least their candidates who have run as independents, do quite strongly. Which again, how, right? I mean, given the kind of crackdown, given that there have been arguments made that the military is sort of this moderating force, and people they're never touched, and people follow what they say in Pakistan. How has it come to be where today Imran Khan and his loyal MNAs, if they do remain loyal, have been able to win 100 plus seats? How did this happen?
Yeah, it's just a great story, and I think that we have to give tremendous credit to PTI for what it was able to do in the very few days before the election. It leveraged one of its greatest strengths, and that is its use of technology and social media to galvanize the support base and mobilize it. There were these last minute get out the vote campaigns that were led on social media and on the internet more broadly. And there was some really terrific reportage in the days leading up to the election that showcased just how far PTI was willing to go. I mean, you actually had cases of PTI leaders who were not able to go out and mobilize and lead rallies because they were afraid they'd get arrested. They recorded videos, and then you had PTI members that would wheel video screens or bring video screens into the middle of town square, so to speak, and broadcast these messages. And then, of course, we've seen PTI use AI to capture the voice of Khan to deliver messages from him. There was a big AI message from him just a few days before the election, and that's another thing that was really worked for PTI is that Khan is just a very special political figure. I think you have to go back to a Zulfikar Ali Bhutto to think of someone that had the type of charisma and galvanizing effect that Khan has. I mean, he is a very popular figure. Of course, he's also a very divisive figure, and he has many enemies. But even though he's been in jail, he had been in jail since August. People had not forgotten about him, and essentially, I would argue that there were many reasons why you ended up having this large turnout of PTI voters. One of them was to vote for Khan, even though Khan was not contesting the election. Basically, they were voting for PTI, they were voting for independence sponsored by PTI, but they were really voting for Khan, and that's what they did. And I think that this is PTI also was able to pull off an election campaign that reflected contemporary Pakistan, which is very different from Pakistan 20, 30, or even 10 or 5 years ago, right? A Pakistan where you have a significant youth bulge, PTI has been able to draw a lot of young voters, and it really appealed to them. It used technology, and the internet penetration, social media penetration has been quite impressive in Pakistan over the last 5, 10, 15 years. I mean, you still only have about 30% of the population that uses social media actively, but talk about a population of 240 million people. That's a lot of people. So it was able to tap into that. But I think at the end of the day, it was a view of the PTI rank and file that they were not going to let it be business as usual when it comes to Pakistani politics. They knew that in the past there have been elections that the military has shaped behind the scenes in advance to get a certain outcome, and PTI voters supporters were not going to stand for that. So that's what I would argue that what we saw with the election from PTI was this incredible demonstration of defiance. That's what it really came down to, this unwillingness to place their fate, or unwillingness to let the military shape the actual election. And again, you had a lot of very enthusiastic, angry for sure as well, young people, young voters that were just fed up with how they had seen this relationship between the military and the broader political sphere over the years. I think it's going to become a case study for Pakistani politics and the study of politics, regardless of how things end up playing out with what the next government looks like. I think that this will be viewed as a seminal moment where you finally had this case where the Pakistani people refused to bend to the will of the army, so to speak. They were willing to defy it.
Right, and that's a very important point you bring up. What does this mean for the Pakistani army going forward? Like, because they've been famous for stage managing in 2018. They did not want the PML to do well. The PTI, Imran Khan was the chosen one. They won 149 seats at that point. Uh, you go back to 2013, Nawaz Sharif was the chosen one. He had returned. He won the elections, won a sizable majority till he was removed for corruption in 2017 from the Panama Papers, right? So there's always been this perception of all these elections being stage managed, with the political class and the military leadership having a sort of Faustian bargain. What do these results mean for the Pakistan military?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would argue that it would deepen what I've described as a crisis of confidence for the military. I mean, if you go back and look at what's played out over that period we were discussing before, the period since Khan was ousted almost 2 years ago, we have seen surges of anti-army sentiment, public sentiment against the army that are quite strong. Again, we have not seen that for quite some time, and I think that one might have to go back to the immediate aftermath of the Bin Laden raid in 2011, where you had such displays of anger at the army. How did this happen, and so on. But I think that what we're seeing now is even deeper, quite frankly. So, and this all comes down to Khan, right? I mean, he had been the one that had been denouncing specific army leaders, including the army chief, as traitors, and calling our security officials murderers, and things that you just don't. These things don't happen, especially for an institution that I would describe as having this sacrosanct status in Pakistan. Certainly, plenty of people haven't liked what the army's done, but rarely do you have this display of anger on such high scale directed against the army. So these things had been building for quite some time, and I think the army felt that it had things back in order in the week leading up to the election. Right, Khan was in jail. The party had gone quiet; it had been hollowed out, and Nawaz Sharif was back. It looked like he was poised to mount a campaign that could probably lead to his party coming back to power, and that's the army's preferred party right now, quite frankly. But then things didn't happen that way at all. So I think that it definitely is a blow to the military. I think that it takes away this sense of invincibility that when it comes to electoral engineering and when it comes to political engineering more broadly, it can get away with whatever it wants to do. So I think that is a big blow. But as we turn this discussion to the future, what's going to come in the days and weeks ahead, I would argue that the army is not necessarily going to be it's not going to suffer catastrophic losses, and that it's the next government will probably be the very type of government that the army would like to see. But I think it's that the perception the perceptions of the Pakistani public vis-a-vis the army, the way those have been impacted by several things, not just the remarkable performance by PTI, but also how the army responded to that. Now, there is a fair amount of evidence, in my view, that the army intervened in the election process after it became clear that the PTI sponsored independents were doing very well. You know, the sudden long delay in releasing the election results, the fact that the election commission was basically on radio silence mode for many hours, and then of course the evidence that's put out there by PTI, but also some others showing that formal election documents known as P45 forms had actually listed, have listed the results from polling stations. And yet, when the official results started coming in from the election commission, you had many cases where the results had been reversed, and particularly in polling stations where PTI independents had been winning per the P45. So there was very specific evidence. And so I think there is a significant, I would just say that there is a significant number of Pakistanis, not just those with PTI, that believe that the military decided to get involved when it saw that things were not going the way that they wanted it to. And I think that for many in Pakistan, and many of the observers on the outside would say this too, ironically, even though the military suffered a big blow when PTI sponsored independence did so well, they could have minimized the losses to their reputation and so on by stepping away and just essentially letting public will play out, so to speak. The fact that they did not, I think, could make things even more difficult for the army, which I would say, the best way to look at this, I think that politically the army will get what it wants with the new government, but I think that the reputational damage to the Pakistani military as an institution will increase, and that sort of plays into what I described before about this crisis of confidence that the Pakistani military faces. That's just going to get worse for them.
Right, and like you mentioned, right, you have multiple permutations and combinations, and the army could get the government at once, which would probably or could look like a PML, PPP, MQM coalition with some smaller parties here and there, and they hit that magic figure of 169. Or the independents could create their own bloc, merge with the MWM or the MQM. There were certain reports in the local media, because if they merge with a party that's won one or two seats in the National Assembly, then they get a pie from the reserved seats, the reserved 70 seats. There's multiple ways of doing this. And there's also the courts, the multiple results that the PTI have taken to courts. What do you see? I know it's fast pacing, it's developing, but what do you see as a very likely outcome from all of these different permutations and combinations?
Right, indeed. Yeah, I don't want to speculate, but in terms of what I see as likely trends and trajectories moving forward, one would basically be a PDM 2.0, essentially a repeat of that brief government that we had after Khan was ousted, led by the PMLN with representation from PPP and several other parties too. If you look at the official results, PPP and PMLN, they have a fair number of seats there together. It wouldn't take them much to put together a new coalition, and they'd be able to draw on other participants in the PDM coalition and some of the smaller parties as well. And that's what the army would prefer to see. And I think that the army would certainly be involved, so to speak, in these negotiations to try to push those sides to come together and so on. And I should say that we're now in a period, this period of horse trading and meetings between the different parties to try to put together an alliance, a coalition. This is a sweet spot for the military, quite frankly. And this is an area where it thrives. Sort of quietly prodding certain people to do certain things. Using various tactics, prodding, pushing, that type of thing. And, you can be sure that it is going to try to shape these negotiations in a way that makes it difficult for the PTI independents to be able to do much of anything. Now, constitutionally, you can't have independents lead a government. So, there's several challenges for PTI, and that indeed that other scenario you mentioned where you have independents that basically put together a coalition with a group of other parties, several challenges there. The first one, and this had been known to be a challenge going into the election, these are, most of the independents that won are PTI sponsored. A small number are not, but most of them are. But there is that concern that since they're independents, they wouldn't actually align with PTI when it comes time to put together the government. And my understanding from PTI, the thinking of PTI leaders, those that are still in a position to be involved in these things, they have done extensive vetting. This is what they've said. They've done extensive vetting to ensure that these independents that they've selected as candidates will actually stay with PTI. But one can't rule anything out. I mean, there's going to be a lot of pressure, I would think, from the establishment, from the military and intelligence and others on these independents that want to not align with PTI, and that's going to make things difficult for PTI. Now, even if they get through that challenge, there'll still be the challenge of finding partners to work with them, knowing that could put them in a tough spot vis-a-vis the military. They could face fresher threats, that type of thing. So, it's ironic that PTI is the opposite of radioactive when it comes to public perceptions, public views. They did very well in the polls, but from a political perspective, it's very risky to work with PTI, given that this is the party that the military does not want to come to power. It's the party that the military has a particularly bitter confrontation with. So that's going to be a bit of a challenge. There are some parties that tend to be chameleons and tend to be willing to work with just about anyone, and I would highlight the MQM as a candidate that might want to work with PTI. MQM did surprisingly well, quite frankly, in the elections. They did pick up a number of seats. And then some of the smaller religious parties may be willing to work with PTI, but PTI just using the votes as the seats obtained by the independents that won, they need to do, they need to get a lot of, they need to do a lot of work to build up that coalition. And this is why, I mean, this is the main reason, one of many reasons why we are going to see PTI aggressively pursuing legal actions to try to reverse some of the results where they lost, because PTI's view, if there had not been extensive rigging, their independents would have gotten many more seats and they wouldn't have to work so hard to put together a coalition. They're still going to try, but it's going to be difficult given how the results played out. So all this to say is I do anticipate that we will see a government looking quite similar to the one that we had with the PDM previously, the one after Khan's ouster. But it's going to be likely a weak government, a fractious one, just like the PDM. You're going to have parties that don't get along. That works very well for the army, right? The army always prefers coalitions that are weak because they're easy to exploit. And that is why, getting back to what I said before, I'll put it this way. I think that the way things have played out to this point, and the way things will likely play out with the next government, it'll represent a Pyrrhic victory for the military, right? Because it's likely going to get the weak coalition that it's sought with the players that it's wanted to be there, but we're going to see the public increasingly aggrieved and angry at the army. It's going to face new challenges. You could have mass mobilization campaigns from PTI if their legal strategies don't work, and that crisis of confidence that I mentioned is going to be there. And at the end of the day, my sense is that the army, what it really wants is for this next government to focus on economic stabilization. It wants there to be less political drama. But if you have this weak government in place, if you have so many PTI supporters that are so angry about what's played out, political stability is only going to get worse. Political instability is only going to get worse in Pakistan. And I don't think that's what the army wants at this juncture.
Right, and that sort of brings me to something that I've mentioned in my introduction, and we've also discussed this, but the kind of playing field that was offered to the PTI was clearly not fair. From Khan's ouster to his jailing to in December, the rulings against the party itself, right? And this was all public. This was reported, the world was watching, but the responses from the US, the UK, the European Union, was quite muted in the build up to the elections. And then you see them, I think the State Department on Friday came out saying, these allegations of interference and fraud need to be investigated. Similarly, you had a similar sounding statement from the EU, and I think Lord Cameron had something along the lines of it was disappointing to see this, but not very vociferous questions from countries that defend democracy globally, or at least argue to. Why? Like what has led to sort of a muted reaction from the rest of the world, especially Western democracies, to what happened in Pakistan?
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. And indeed, I mean, it's true that the reactions we've seen from the West, they've all been not only muted, but similarly muted. And I would argue that the tone and messaging of all of these statements, the US one, the EU one, the UK one, a few others, they're all very similar. Basically, we're concerned, we call for an investigation, but regardless, we're going to continue to work with the next government, whatever it looks like. Um, and it is notable that compared to the reactions to the Bangladesh election, which had similar issues, to put it mildly, in that case, the U.S. and many Western partners actually rejected the election. They described it as not free and fair. That was not the case with the Pakistan one. Several factors here. One, I think that these Western players want to be cautious and they don't want to jump to conclusions. Unlike an analyst like me, who's sort of thought things through and looked at some evidence. I think that governments they want to see the results of something, an investigation or some type of formal assessment before they make a formal declaration as to what they think. So that could keep them from being more critical. Though, quite frankly, I'm not confident that Pakistan is going to carry out a credible investigation of this election. But beyond that, several things. One is that I think that the Americans, in particular, other Western capitals as well, want to remain aloof, or not aloof, but remain sort of distant from the political churn in Pakistan. Just because, in the case of the U.S., it was dragged into Pakistani politics in ways that it did not want to be, because Imran Khan, had this very strong and ultimately very popular, quite frankly, narrative about how the U.S. had conspired and worked with the army and the opposition to overthrow him. This is a narrative that's not right. The U.S. did not conspire in his ouster. But because of that, I think the U.S. has become very concerned. Has not wanted to say anything that could be construed as taking a particular side in the political situation in Pakistan. I think that's the case to some extent as well with some of the other countries. I mean, you have had what I would describe as routine diplomatic meetings between, the British the British High Commissioner as well as the U.S. Ambassador with political figures across the spectrum in Pakistan in recent months. This is what diplomats do. They meet with political figures in the countries they're serving in. But given the times and given how tense it is, many in Pakistan, particularly PTI, basically pointed to that as some example of collusion or conspiracy. So I think that for those reasons, there's a desire to just stay back, so to speak. Final point, and this gets into more provocative issues, but I think are quite accurate. The Western capitals are always very comfortable, not always, typically comfortable engaging with the Pakistani military, and they tend to privilege their relations with the Pakistani military. We, even in a period where it's been 15 straight years of formal civilian rule, there's still a desire to engage with the generals because they're perceived as the most important, influential interlocutor, which is true. And when you need to engage with Pakistan on important things, you got to talk to the army. So in that sense, I think that there's a desire not to sort of upset the apple cart, so to speak, and not antagonize the military. I would argue that's a wrong-headed position to take. I think that the military views its relations with the West right now as very important because they're critical trade partners, donors. The military wants to deal with its economic crisis. Anyway, I think that's another view. And then finally, well, two more quick points. One is that Khan certainly burned a lot of bridges in Western capitals during that period after he was ousted, and even going back before. I mean, we know about his policies over the years, and yeah, I think that particularly what happened with Khan and his very direct accusations of the U.S. State Department official of trying to oust him. I think in Washington, there's very little appetite to sort of step out and take a position that would be perceived as aligning with Khan and his supporters. again, you could turn that in a different way and say, well, look, if the U.S. really has public diplomacy goals in Pakistan, what's to keep it from offering a message of concern, strong concern about what played out, and couching that in the context of wanting to see the Pakistani people, the Pakistani public having a chance to have the public will reflected. I'm not being very articulate, but what I mean is that there could be ways for the U.S. to be more critical of the election in ways that cast it as, well, look, the public will of Pakistan was subverted, so to speak. They wouldn't use those terms, but I think there are ways of going about that in ways that would reduce the possibility that they would be perceived of taking a position that sides with Khan and sides with PTI. But the final point I'll make here, and I'll be very candid, Pakistan is not a big priority at the end of the day for the international community, particularly the West. I mean, we know what's going on around the world, right? Wars, crises, and so on. So I think that there's a desire to, or not a desire, there's not much political capital, not much policy space out there to be really fixated and focused on this one particular election in Pakistan. So that may also explain the fact that you had a statement that was a bit critical, but relatively boilerplate. And the view, I think, in Western capitals is to issue the statement and then move on to the other things that are taking up much more attention at this juncture.
Right, and then that was my final question, but it was very interesting to see sort of the lines drawn between how the US reacted with the Bangladesh elections a month ago and here. And one could make that argument, like you did, relatively similar conditions, but in one case, came out heavily, and in one case they said boilerplate, we'll look at this investigations. That was a very interesting sort of lines on there. But on that note, Michael, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see how the next few days and weeks plays out. Thank you for joining the print.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.